I'm Tom Davenport. I'm the moderator for this panel, mostly a professor at Babson College, although I have a couple of minor, not paying very well appointments at MIT as well. Also a senior advisor to Deloitte, which pays a little bit better. We have had a somewhat chaotic last 24 hours relative to this panel. One of our panelists, Anaf Durrani, had an unspecified family emergency that I found out about 7 o'clock last night. And then about 10 o'clock last night, Raj Nimagata, one of our other panelists, said that she had injured her ankle moving her daughter out of her college dorm. So she won't be joining us. Fortunately, Alan and his colleagues are very enterprising and rounded up a couple of alternative panelists for us, which was very nice. Our only original panelist who's here is Jayashree Sivasubramanian. Thank you. She is the Senior Vice President of Client Success for Cprime, one of our sponsors, and worked for Cognizant also for many years in the data and analytics space, so very knowledgeable about this domain. Next is John Spens, who kindly volunteered last night at dinner, I think, right? I've known John for a while. He's at Thoughtworks and is the VP of Data Modernization, and God knows we all need that. Right? And then finally, I think just this morning, right, Vipin Gupta stepped up to the plate. He is the president and CTO, and I think has some other titles, of a company called Flipt, which is a pharmacy benefit management company. We know that's where all the money goes in our healthcare system. That's why he's so well dressed today. He was previously CIO and Chief Innovation and Digital Officer for Toyota Financial Services, and at Key Bank before that, where he told me that we met, and I, of course, forgot all about that. Anyway, I think it's a great panel, and of course, data is a big issue relative to AI. It was a little bit less of an issue, or I'll let the panelists comment on how much less of an issue it was until November 30th, 2022, which, as many of you know, that was when AI was invented, right? A lot of people do seem to think that. But a year ago or so, I did a survey sponsored by Amazon Web Services about data and generative AI, mostly with chief data officers, but some CIOs as the respondents. And in this survey, as in almost every survey I have been involved in or seen, about 80 to 90% of the respondents say, yeah, generative AI is going to transform our company. However, we're not very far along. In my survey with AWS, only 6% had any production deployment yet. I've done some surveys earlier this year that suggest we're maybe up to 20, or in some cases 25% with a production deployment. I think McKinsey had a survey, a global survey, saying 1% felt like they had a mature implementation of generative AI. For many people, data was the biggest obstacle to success. 93% in this AWS survey said that a data strategy was critical, a new data strategy was critical for succeeding with generative AI, but 57% had made no changes whatsoever to their data at that point. When we asked, do you have the right data foundation for generative AI, 11% agreed strongly anyway, and I think in that case, agreeing sort of really indicates you don't have the right data foundation. 11% agreed strongly that they had the right data foundation for it. Only 17% said they were curating their documents. And as you probably know, documents are the source of a lot of the relatively unstructured data in generative AI. So we don't want to talk just about generative AI in this panel, but of course that's the newest thing and the thing that requires data that most of us haven't really given a whole lot of thought to until recently. So let's start by talking about life before November 30th, 2022. Wondering if each of you could comment on whether you or your clients, if you are a consultant, had a pretty good data management environment for what I call analytical AI. I hate this term traditional AI. That makes zero sense. Some people call it legacy AI. I wanted to shoot them. Analytical AI, deals with structured data. It involves machine learning of the more traditional type. It generates predictions in most cases rather than generating content. And I would probably argue that for many organizations, you want to make money with AI, it's still the easiest way to do it, unless you're in a very content-intensive business. But before generative AI became popular in November 2022, did we have things in pretty good shape? I don't know, who wants to comment on that first?
I can get started. Good morning, everyone. So I think the maturity of the organization varied across, right? There were a lot of matured organization with the data management who had robust data lakes, robust pipelines, and they were actually early in taking some of the decision making, right? They used their data effectively to do the insights and decision making. But there are some who were still siloed. They were looking at data in a very siloed construct. They're not able to effectively utilize their data management and lacked also a lot of governance. As Tom was talking exactly about the late 2022, 2023, beginning of 2023, there are some organizations who started investing or dabbling about NLP, right? The natural language processing.
You're saying before ChatGPT,
yes,
they had dabbled in NLP?
Exactly.
Sure.
And invested, and they really understood the basics of the language modeling, how it's evolving, the pipelines are changing from ETLs to embedded pipeline, right? Those companies have really skyrocketed this era of Gen AI, who has thought and invested there. I know he doesn't like the term traditional AI. So
call it analytical AI, please.
Yeah.
I'll give you $5 after the panel if you do. Yeah.
Okay, I will ensure I get as many multiples of $5 at the end of the session.
One-time offer.
Thanks for the call out. So historically, companies and organizations are very good with working with the structured data. We have all done this for ages, right? It's also the evolution of the data management. Be it we want to do a fraud detection, a churn prediction, demand forecasting. They are organizations which has pioneered into doing that, playing around structured data, but very well versed with analytical AI models and all of those stuffs. But when it comes to unstructured data, just before the era of Gen AI, are they even prepared? Do they even know how to process a text, image, or any unstructured data to its maximum potential was still a question mark in everyone's mind, right? And there were some very evident gaps. There is clearly a before Gen AI and after Gen AI. So before, or the stage of scratching the surface of Gen AI, there's a lot of issues with how do we do metadata management and labeling of unstructured data was not very relevant, or it was not even in the focus, right? Data quality, it has always been an issue, even now, right? As more and more data it is, but it was even more complex when it comes to unstructured data. How are we going to manage the data quality?
And we're going to talk about that, but
Yeah.
let's talk about the sort of prehistory a
Right.
little bit more.
Exactly.
John, you work on data modernization. Do we still need to modernize our structured data?
No, we're all done.
Oh,
Everything's
good.
good.
Okay.
Yeah, when we're thinking about the question last night, I thought I suffer from a little bit of selection bias here because the clients that I've been working with are still actually at that time and even today are still struggling with some of the governance and management practices that support structured data and even basic analytics, not even getting into analytical AI. So we're still seeing many organizations that have made the leap to the cloud and using modern architectures, modern tools, Spark-based aggregation and such, but didn't quite get the house in order. And so there are still many issues around establishing firm business glossaries and definition of metrics, understanding how those are calculated and created. I think one of the areas too that at that point, and now we're really seeing explode, is the collection and processing of metadata. So to the point you were bringing up. So I felt like many organizations were still getting their arms around how do I enable modern technologies to provide that insight because my governance and management practices haven't caught up.
Yeah, it would have been nice if we'd gotten that easy stuff done when the hard stuff came along,
Right.
but we hadn't. Vipin, you worked with that structured data in financial services in a big way, right?
Yeah, so large organizations, legacy organization, enterprises. I think this question itself is a bit of a theoretical question. I think this idea of having an organized data and an organized way of accessing data is a theoretical goal because in practicality, if you think about these large enterprises, they are extremely complex machines. They're continuously changing. We keep adding more and more parts to this machine. We keep adding more and more suppliers to this machine. We keep adding new patterns to this machine. So I think this idea that one day we will have an organized data is, I think, a theoretical goal. So instead of assuming that it will be all organized, we need to plan for this level of diversity and a growing diversity. It's like this idea that instead of having an organized fort or a fortress, I think this is a growing forest. And everything that we do has to be designed around this idea that this is a continuously evolving machine, which will be complex, and we will never really have a fully organized data environment or a fully modernized data environment because we will be dealing with 1970s technologies for the next 10 years or more in banks. Still, we are running the core systems on 1970s systems. So we have to worry about that. We have to worry about what's coming down the pike, and there are all ranges of patterns in between. So the idea is how do you organize, or what does it mean when we call it organized? And the question becomes, what's the purpose? If the purpose is ultimately to do analytics AI, then we have to be able to enable analytics AI with this level of diversity and fragmentation, and we need to be okay with that fragmentation. Only then we'll be able to solve the problem. Otherwise, we're just chasing a theoretical question. So that's just my point of view, and that's what we were trying to do. Even a large organization like Toyota, we said, okay, this is going to be diverse. We know that this is going to be how it is. What we need to do is to enable analytics AI, or even at that time before ChatGPT, is provide access to where we need that data for whatever algorithms or analytics models that we're building, and we re-architected everything around that idea that there's going to be always diversity. So that was just another way to approach it.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, 30 years ago, I wrote a book called Information Ecology that said, the metaphor that we're going to have a finely architectured data environment, so it's never going to happen.
Right.
And thinking about it as an ecosystem is a much more feasible thing to do. I don't know. I think the book is still in print. Operators are standing by. They've been standing by for 30 years, and not that many people call them. But anyway, I think if we could transition to that worldview, we'd probably be a lot more successful. So, but how about now in the post-Gen AI period? Everybody seems to be thinking we need to pivot. What does pivoting toward managing unstructured data mean? I don't know, John, you want to start us off this time?
Sure. So in many ways, in looking through this, the practices or the areas of focus are thoughts about quality, the 6 dimensions of quality. These haven't changed necessarily, but the complexity is the challenge. And working in the life sciences industry in particular with one client and thinking about your adhering to HIPAA guidelines around obfuscation of data, anonymization of data, the fact that the model can leak information or present, even make assumptions or produce results that might break those rules of anonymization and enable the expert determination capabilities. So thinking through, I'm looking at content, what does that content communicate? Much harder than it was when we were trying to just look at structured data, at various data points. So that is, and I think when you talk about the numbers in adoption, I think these are the challenges. People are afraid, they're concerned, rightly so, protecting their organization. What sort of information we're putting out there? So being able to both govern the inputs to the model and do a better job with unstructured data and saying, what does this document communicate? But then also having controls to look at the outputs of the model and say, are we actually still violating those controls?
Yeah, which makes me very nervous because I recently read somewhere that only 20% of documents, output documents, ever get examined by any human, right? With generative AI, pretty scary. Vipin, what do you think about that? Is that an issue in the pharmacy benefit management space?
Yeah, and we can talk about banking, pharmacy benefits as well, and in all these industries in general. I think as we think about this pivot, the biggest challenge is not just access to data. I think the bigger challenge that we are facing is the trainability of data. Right? That's the biggest challenge that we have. And awareness of where the data lies is another big challenge. And the reason we are not able to train the data, there are various reasons for it, but one of the biggest reasons is that we have such a diversity of information, the data that's there, and we have all kinds of layers of legacy around it. So the interpretation and even understanding what the data is, the meaning and the cause and effect between the data is not there. So, and that to me is the bigger challenge. And that pivot isn't happening. And that is what is coming in the way outside of what we talk about from a content point of view, which is a lot of the work that is happening is around the content. But if you really get into applying the business data in the context of the content, that's what's coming in the way. The trainability of the data is our biggest challenge. And if you really take it one more step further, we don't have a good understanding of the meaning of the data in our organizations. Take any bank for that matter. We have hundreds of systems with all kinds of layers around, like decade-old systems. We don't even know what the data actually means. Right? The semantics is missing. The fundamental grammar is missing in this vocabulary. And to build that vocabulary is the biggest challenge that we have. I think that's what's coming in the way, in my view. And I think that's the kind of pivot we are not able to make. Most organizations, we are struggling with that. But that's when the shift is starting to happen, or will happen.
So you're saying we don't even have any common definition of key terms and concepts in our organizations, right? I'm dating myself here, but also roughly 30 years ago, I coined Davenport's law of common information. How many of you are perfectly aware of what that means? I'm sure you don't even want to raise your hand. Carrie Wilson nicely raised hers. It said the more an organization knows or cares about a particular business entity, information entity in its business, the less likely it is to agree on a common term and meaning for it.
That's right.
So, I don't know, in pharmacy benefit, do you have a common definition of what's a claim, for example?
So yes and no.
See, Davenport's law revealed once again.
It's never yes or no. It's yes and no, both. Yes, there is some standardization around the data stream, the claim, what does it mean? But still, I think there's a lot of variation on how we interpret that and how we process it, and then how it translates into all kind of other processes. So standardization is on a very, very narrow stream of data. But there are lots of other peripheral data sources and data elements. They're not obviously well defined, and they have all kind of interpretation. And that's where it starts to get very interesting, because that's what gives us our unique language. Because we don't want to be over-standardized, right? Standardization is for the process, but what gives us uniqueness is the differentiation or differences in our languages. So I think that's whether it's a pharmacy benefits management or even in financial services, I think that continues to be the challenge. And that's why we go back to this idea that the understanding and the trainability of our data becomes the biggest challenge for us. How do we define what the data is and then train it so in a way that then can be interpreted and then can be applied in all these different contexts, right? We have legacy systems in banks, in pharmaceutical companies, and everywhere. They are written in 1970s. People who knew what that meant they're not there.
They're dead now.
They're not
At least
there.
retired.
We have to figure that out. Not only that, then we have to have a common a language, a vocabulary of what that is, and then translate that into something that can be used in the purpose of whether we apply it in context of AI or any other.
So just to pick on that point for a second, and then going back to the original question, still seeing many organizations, and the concept, these tools or concepts are many decades old, but a business glossary, a metadata model for the organization. And the example you give, a heavy equipment manufacturer, and they say, our data is garbage. I get 5 different prices for building this one piece of heavy equipment. And when we dug into it, had nothing to do with their data. It was, well, what do you mean? Do you mean when you built it back in 1979? Do you mean if you were going to try and build it today? Or do you have the steel you need in stock? Or are you going out in the market to buy it? So these definitions, understanding the data, these permeate throughout our organizations. And now, the challenge is we are expecting, in the past, we would look and say, well, this value is null, or I don't know what this means, but now we're having a model generate content with a very definitive and high level of confidence. It might be wrong, but it's very confident in what it's saying to you.
Often wrong, but never in doubt.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Jayashree,
So,
what
yeah.
kinds of pivots are you seeing your clients making?
I think training and what John was mentioning about the garbage in, garbage out, right? We typically
Is that a
say
new term, garbage in, garbage out? I never heard that before. Yeah.
It's a commonly used term for data management, and now I think we elevate the pitch as garbage in and hallucination out in the Gen AI world. But that said, I think one other important thing which is the pivot which is happening is changing from maybe governance to guardrails, right? For example, here we are not talking about governance more. It's about what is the content, how is the model behaving on top of a fuzzy data input, and all of these things. So the overall governance is translated into what guardrails, what security we need to keep in place to have a controlled environment, right?
Automated whenever possible.
Exactly. And in Cprime, we have always done a lot of transformation working with the customers. So generally transformation reminds us of 3 common terminologies, right? Like people, process, technologies have to evolve on a transformation. In this AI era, we are even rethinking it. Does it make sense, or is it even relevant? So we came up with 4 M's for AI transformation, right? Its first thing is majority of it is not technology, it's a mindset shift. So that's the first M, which is mindset shift, changing from human determined to machine driven and recursive, right? And the second M is more on mechanics are changing. How we deal with things, what are the tools we are going to change, how do we use them is everyday changing. The third M is machine readiness. Today, we are going to deploy more agents, and the agents actually act. They are not just going to report, right? There's a huge difference between how the agents behave in the system. And last but not the least is the medium evolution, right? Today, AI-driven experience has to touch all the user experience, user touch points to make it real. So we are even brainstorming the transformation should have new dimensions to it in this AI era. So that's another pivot we are consciously doing to work with our partners and organizations.
Great. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to see if anybody has any questions or comments. So I want to ask, any of you want to comment, is data management for unstructured data primarily about RAG, retrieval augmented generation, taking our own internal data and adding it to LLMs, or is it broader than that?
Well, I would definitely argue broader, and for once, instead of talking about as a consultant and our clients, our own experience adopting these tools and using the product Glean within the organization. And we've been using the Google suite of applications, and so we've got all our content out on Drive. And our internal folks came to us and said, hey, listen, we've just discovered this is a mess. All of the documents, your multiple copies of this presentation, what is the current standard, which one is the right one, and establishing that structure around your content. What are the rules around document creation? We have great rules around the creation of structured data, right? So I think there are aspects to it of thinking, how do I introduce, or how do I apply RAG and build a framework to support this? But step one is, now you have to start applying some rules. This is the standard version. It may not be the latest version, but this is the authentic copy of this particular document. I need to standardize the language so that we're looking at things effectively. I need to label content, working with a legal firm. And they're saying, listen, we have all of this well-structured content, but laws apply in different domains. So what is applicable to criminal law versus corporate law, very different things. So having to tag it and enrich that data. I think to your point about enabling people or enabling our systems to understand that data better. So I think it's much broader.
Actually, human activity rather than a technical activity to define what is the best proposal document in a particular space, or the best kind of contract that's going to be the standard, or whatever?
It's a mix of both, I would say.
Yeah, there has to be a human in the loop, or an augmentation. Is you have to have that. There's that context. There's always Cathy O'Neill, author of Weapons of Mass Destruction, had described this great many years ago. It's like, I can sit here and put a model together and tell you exactly what happened, but I need that individual who has the context to come in and say, why? Why do I see this pattern of behavior? And so that augmentation of that individual, that providing that additional context that the model might provide and might generate and recognize, but you need that confirmation.
So it's really moving from this mindset of automation to autonomation, if I can say that. Like, the autonomous part of this whole use cases, if you can say, in this context is what matters. I think that's where the future is going to be, where we have to design our processes, where we bring these elements of data, the AI, the agents, and all these elements to really completely rethink what that future autonomous processes will look like. And I think that's where the shift is going to happen. And I think that's where you will see a different way to think about this problem around, is our data fully we have labeled it, do we have fully understanding of the data? Because one way to think about this is we don't have to use the traditional ways to label the data, right? We had to rethink how we are going to label, how we're going to understand the data. And I think that new thinking is still evolving, but just using the old style of labeling the data to understand the data is extremely, extremely difficult task, especially when our data keeps growing. Not only data, our data, the elements keep growing at a much, much faster pace.
I agree, because one of the important things is also like in RAG, right? It's about how we see the unstructured data as a structured knowledge. That's all about it, right? Because how can we make it clean? How can we make it labeling, as you mentioned, and traceable how do we even optimize it? Because in a kind of unstructured environment, there is a lot of duplication of data, unwanted information. So the RAG has to really work on cleansing and picking up the right context and pulling it up for the labeling, right? Especially, we have all seen this in our day-to-day life. We have now working in meetings, virtual meetings, right? Be it Zoom or Teams. Every tool now has a RAG enabled in it. You have an AI note taker, and after the minute, you get the minutes of the meeting. And you can see that it's very succinct and crisp, and even moves to an action items of it, right? Everything is controlled so that the efficiency and the quality of the output is more viable and more appropriate for the time. But as John mentioned, it is not removing the human intelligence or insights acting on it. So even though the systems are intelligent enough, look into the past, look into the future, and can give a lot of recommendations on what is the art of possible to action on a particular situation, there is a human intervention has to happen to take the right decision. And more, there is a domain skill requirements have increased in this AI era, I would say.
Well, yeah, and I don't know how many people take those notes that come out of Zoom or Otter or whatever and apply those to the organization as the official record of this meeting, and then the lawyers step up and say, no, we don't really want that to be noted as an official record. We could be sued for that information or whatever. Can be very complex.
See, that's where we need the human intervention.
Yeah, we still need the lawyers.
Yeah.
They'll be the last to go. Any comments or questions for this panel? We got one up front here. Supposedly a microphone is on its way. Sorry, you'll be next.
Can you guys hear me? Oh, there we go. Good morning, everyone. Drew Illingworth from Cone Resnick. I lead our CIO advisory. Just wanted to ask you guys, do you think that this is a temporary moment in time or a growing pain, and that once we push through this moment, most of the data generated that our businesses will need will be generated by AI, and therefore presumably better organized right from the jump for it to reuse for itself, almost a self-fulfilling prophecy? Just hoping you guys could comment on that a little bit.
Are we headed for AI-driven data nirvana is the question here.
Again, from my perspective, again, working for large organizations, I'm a little bit more jaded by the practicality of that. I think, yes, someday it'll happen. But I think there's a long journey to get there. I think there is still a lot of data, the information that is evolving. And I think we have to keep in mind there's a new kind of data sets that have not been even introduced yet. They will be introduced along the way. And to get to that point of nirvana, I think it's going to take some time. But we have to really find ways. On the other hand, I believe that there are going to be tools and techniques that will be available to us. We are building those techniques where we will have LLMs and others or AI-based tools that will help us interpret this data, the legacy. But it's going to be a long time before we catch up to a place where we can then get to that state that you're referring.
I like the point you raised before, and that you said theoretical. I would change that to aspirational, and saying that it is a constant. It is to use Stuart's analogy earlier today, it's the shields and weapons, shields and arrows. We're constantly working through this process. New technologies come in. I am continually floored by the capabilities that are provided. But very much to your point, then the new data set comes along, or the new context in which we're using the data. And so as the question and answer process continues, then no, we still need more. We still need more intervention.
Yep, I agree. In fact, the synthetic data creation is a huge process of AI generating data itself, right? But it helps pretty much, in my experience, on the generative AI side, where pretty much the decisions are making or judgments are getting created. That you need a lot of synthetic data and exploration of the data sets, right? But when it comes to more of precision, we'll still use ML as a way of doing, because it actually takes you to the nth level of precision, and you cannot have synthetic data around it to get to the precision level. It's a mix of both. But will that stop? I don't think so. I think we have to equip ourselves to manage the robust data and effectively have a robust mechanism to use the data. And there's no end to this exploration phase, is what I would say.
Question.
This gentleman right
Question
here.
from the back of the room. Question from the back of the room. Beth Kurth, executive producer, MIT Sloan CFO Summit, to which you are also all invited. My question is about legacy data, and you've talked about the issues of standardizing or using that, processing it. And I know when we were talking in the past with structured data, there was a limit. Maybe you only go back 3 or 5 years. With legacy unstructured data, is there thoughts on how far back you want to go to capture and use that data?
So sorry to jump in. There is a client in the energy industry. They are currently looking at 20th and even 19th century logbooks to go back and say, and obviously the OCR challenges, the language challenges are huge with this, but their intent is to go back and say, hey, listen, we've looked across the Permian and we've identified what we think are all of the available wells. Maybe there are more. So there are limitations, and obviously as you go back further, it's going to be much more of a challenge, but there is the opportunity to create that depth of content over periods of decades.
Yeah, also, we know that some of the data is limited when we want to go in the past. So I think the interesting application is going to be just like we have been extrapolating the future, there will be extrapolation of the past as well. So the question is, for your organization, for your company, or for your industry, how far do you really want to go? How far of the far is really relevant for you? In some organizations, if you're a retail bank, you don't really need to go as far as, say, if you're in a wealth management business, 2 different subcontexts within one industry. But there is a possibility that we will continue to keep extrapolating as far as we can based on the data we have.
And this is an exception. There is one industry is a total exception to how far we can go, which is insurance, right? If you have a 50-year-old policy, you still need to trace during the life cycle of the policy. So there's a lot of industries with a lot of exceptions around how much of data makes it relevant, but depends on what are we, that is why we say that for any analytical purpose, fit to purpose, and what are we trying to do actually gives us a cream of what is a curation that has to happen in the data process.
So we're changing the name from legacy data to heritage data. It sounds much. Sir, you had your hand up a while ago.
So the question, I think, is my question is about defining data quality and data standards, right? So data. You talked about data organization. Our data is not necessarily organized well. We might have a governance or standards, but not all of it complies to those standards, and of course the quality is not always there. And a friend of mine talks about that and compares that to that of water purification, right? So if you just need water for the plants, you could take sewage water, take it through one cycle of cleaning, and ta-da, you're good to go. But then you got to keep cleaning it for drinking purposes, for labs, for chemical labs, et cetera, right? So, and it's not standard across all the data sets within an organization. So I think most organizations are actually struggling in figuring out, which segment of my data needs to, comply to which levels of quality, and that's where we end up either trying to clean the whole thing, to the highest level, or kind of like in a white one or nothing scenario. Are there tools or are there methodologies to use AI to actually figure out for the purpose which segments of the data need to comply to which standards, and how far do we want to take it in that purification process?
I don't know
That's
of
a
any tools like that. Any of you?
Maybe you should put a incubator team and start creating for that.
Start a new business to solve that problem.
That's an evolution of a new business. I think data quality has never had a perfect answer, ever in the history of since we have started dealing with data, right? But there are different approaches to handle the problem statement, what you just narrated or articulated. So generally what has worked well in my experience is more of a kitchen sink approach. Take a set of data and also come out with what is the outcomes we want to generate out of it. Many companies, what they prefer doing is identify a list of use case and try to solve it with data and AI angle to it. As Vipin mentioned, it is training the data sets is very expensive. So that is the reason initially we have seen that a lot of companies and organizations failed, because they were very aspirational in trying to solve 25 use cases and train 25 different data sets, and the cost will be rocket high, and they were not getting the ROI at that defined time, and many people drop it off at the early stage of it. So this kitchen sink approach tries to resolve some of these challenges, because you take a set of data and try to maximize the cleaning process or labeling or metadata handling of it, and have a set of use cases which is going to increase your ROI and the investment you've made on training the data. And many organizations have seen enormous returns of investment on this kind of an approach. But unfortunately, it's still an exploration phase, and I don't know if we'll have a perfect answer to solve all the data quality issues. I think it's a compromise we make, like what is the outcome to what we have.
I will say,
unfortunately, John, we are out of time. So we have good news and bad news from this session. The bad news is that AI is not going to solve all of your data problems, and in fact, it may create a number of new ones. The good news is you're working in data management, data modernization, et cetera. You will have a job for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much to our panelists, and we'll move to the next.